There are many dangers to space travel. The hard vacuum all around you and the radiation. The chance of a stray micrometeoroid punching clean through your ship's hull, and the fact that if you judge your FTL route wrong, a gravity well could rip your ship apart. And of course being cooped up with the same bunch of clowns for months on end until you're ready to jump into the nearest black hole. But one of the most primeval fears, one that goes all the way back to the days when the height of technology was a rock tied to a stick, is that there are things out there in the darkness that are hungry for flesh of an unsuspecting traveler. And in the void of space, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Nonsense, of course. No rational person could believe that out there somewhere aliens lay waiting to feast on our flesh. Any species smart enough to reach the stars would have better things to do. Any species not that smart wouldn't be much of a threat. On the other hand, the universe is a big place, a very big place. It takes a certain kind of person to become a spacer. You have to be okay with a lack of creature comforts for a start. Oh, don't get me wrong. It's not like in ancient times when spaceships were just a metal pod bolted to a rocket. But, ironically, space tends to be limited on a spaceship. I can't remember the equations off the top of my head, but you'd be shocked just how much an extra square meter of volume adds to the stress on the FTL pods. Mathematically necessary claustrophobia. And because you're generally living in fairly cramped conditions, unless you're working for the Science Consortium, lucky bastards, you have to be able to get on well with people, not ruffle any feathers. You also have to be okay with knowing that if something goes wrong, help is usually a long, long way away. Spacers tend to be the self-reliant sort. It's not for everyone, that's for sure. Most of the friends I had growing up have never left homeworld, and the ones that have didn't stay in space for any longer than it took to get from point A to point B. Oh, they'd post long messages afterwards about how transcendent it felt to be out among the stars. But they didn't go back into space again any sooner than they had to, which is a shame, I always thought. After all, we're not Toktok, or UNK, or Kalukamsku, or any of the other species that evolution cruelly limited to plodding along the ground. We're Amia. Flight is in our nature, and if you don't feel a certain wanderlust in your bones, then you're not as in touch with yourself as you should be, in my opinion. I might have expressed this opinion once or twice, maybe implied that some of my planet-bound friends didn't have the courage of a fledgling, all in the spirit of encouraging their sense of adventure. Sometimes you have to give a little nudge out of the nest if you want to see them fly. But I may have built up a slight reputation for thinking I'm some sort of big-shot spacer. Not true, of course. I don't think I'm any better than the planet-bound, nor do I think I'm any kind of great explorer. I only work freighters and passenger liners after all. But that's what some people think of me. Me and my big beak. I should learn to keep it shut every once in a while. I was first mate on a freighter which had been contracted to deliver supplies to a brand new science station in a system so remote that it didn't even have a name. 10-person crew, 377-day round trip. The ship was called the Featherlight, which was a misnomer if ever there was one because it was built like a slab of granite. The cargo was mostly technical equipment for the geology team, although there were some personal items for the researchers. The distance was well beyond the range of most freighters, but apart from that, it was a pretty standard job. It wasn't until we were on our way back that we discovered that one of the researchers must have been keeping something corrosive in their personal storage container. Never found out what it was, but we did find out that it had eaten through the container, the deck, and the power relay that was unfortunately located right beneath. Even more unfortunately, we didn't find that out until there was a minor power surge in that section. Totally harmless in most cases, and the faulty relay exploded and started a fire that damaged both the power system and the life support system. If we'd been on a regular mission, we would have been able to limp home on low power, but we were way too far out for that. The safest option seemed to be to try and make it back to the science station. They didn't have the resources to repair the ship, but they did have a working life support system, which was more than we would soon. Plus, we might be able to find out whose carelessness had left us stranded in deep space and give them a piece of our minds, and the contents of our sewage processing unit all over their quarters, preferably while they were sleeping there. However, it was far from certain that we'd be able to make it that all the way back. We sent out a distress signal purely as a matter of form, but we knew there were no Amia ships remotely nearby, and we were a long way from the inhabited space of any other sentient species. At least, so we thought. We could not have been more surprised when we picked up a transmission. The message was short. The ship identified itself as the cargo vessel Oberon, and suggested that we seek assistance from the orbital colony in the Delta Cassiopeii system. We had no idea what any of those names meant, of course, but fortunately the Oberon appended a set of coordinates. Annoyingly, they had delivered their message translated into our language. Fairly poorly translated, in fact, but grammar aside, we could understand it fine. Comprehension wasn't the issue. The issue was that we had no way of knowing what the original language had been, and therefore no way of knowing what species had sent it. Granted, it made some sense to return our transmission in the language it had been sent, but it left us with no idea of what we would find when we got to those coordinates. What if they were WRickwrites, and we found ourselves at a station that could only offer services to people who could withstand environmental conditions a few hundred degrees and several hundred atmospheres above what we'd consider comfortable? Or, almost as bad, what if they were Tok, and we had to spend months politely nodding as they tried to barter us out of everything we had on board? Not that it was likely to be either of those. Our star charts didn't list any kind of colony, station, or temporary outpost at those coordinates, and they were updated regularly with information from all known sentient species. There was the possibility that our charts were out of date for one of the species we had less regular contact with, like the Askokamoki, but even then there was no sane reason for them to have a presence out here in the middle of nowhere. After some debate, we tried to ask the Oberon for clarification but received no answer. Our sensors hadn't picked up an FTL wake from them, so it was likely they weren't nearby and had only briefly been in range to pick up our transmission. Lucky for us. Or, we were getting messages from a ghost ship, telling us to go to a ghost station, which one of the younger engineers suggested. We're spacers. We're allowed to be superstitious. We're not allowed to be stupid, though, and since we'd only have to deviate slightly on our route back to the science station, it would have been stupid not to check out the coordinates. It was a nerve-wracking journey, but we managed to keep the ship together long enough to get to Delta Cassiopeii. And it turned out it wasn't a ghost station. It was much worse than that. It was humans. Now, in fairness to us, this was a while ago. Humans had only just come onto the galactic scene, and although I'd sort of vaguely heard of them, some problem with the Kalukamsku? Knowledge about them was hard to come by. Our species certainly weren't at the point of swapping star charts, or much other information for that matter, and much of what the Amia knew was acquired second-hand through the Kalukamsku. Half of our crew had barely heard of them, and the other half didn't know more than a few headlines. You can probably guess what was the one piece of information that we all knew. That's right, their diet. The only sentient species yet discovered who were carnivores. Enough to make your feathers stand on end just thinking about it. Still, any port in a storm. We were really about to test that aphorism, but our life support was looking shaky, so we didn't have much choice. The colony was a space station orbiting a rocky planet, albeit one with a heavy cloud layer, a permanent roiling smog storm of a world that might have been in the early stages of terraforming. The station was a classic half-cylinder with two habitable areas, each a quarter of the circumference and roughly a kilometer long, rotating opposite each other 200 meters from a central hub. Most species come up with something similar during their first forays into space. Even the most radically different species are still operating under the same laws of physics. Although, of course, we were the exception to that. Since Amia have no problem moving around while weightless, our pioneer ancestors just put magnets on everything they didn't want floating around. Until the day came when artificial gravity was so ubiquitous, it was more convenient to outfit a whole station than put magnets on every individual fruit cup. For people who were in space long-term, they used to use centrifugal sleeping pods to prevent bone density loss. I've always been very glad I wasn't a spacer back then. The initial contact went well, or at least as well as could be expected. To say they were surprised to see us would be an understatement. The station identified itself as the autonomous colony Svalbard, a protectorate of the United Nations of Earth, and at first instructed us to make contact with Earth directly, as they didn't have the authority to negotiate with anyone not part of the UN alliance. However, once we explained that we were suffering from a serious malfunction and needed urgent assistance, they agreed to help. Strangely, it was more comforting that they tried to get rid of us at first. If they saw us as a free meal, they'd have invited us on board the moment we showed up. There followed a lot of tedious but necessary back and forth about environmental requirements and possible pathogen transfer. The station at least had a basic primer on Amia, along with all the other spacefaring species, the kind of details that form part of the core database of every spacefaring vessel, there to make sure that if they encounter another species on their voyage, They don't accidentally kill each other. The humans seem to have got their copy from the UNK, who aren't the most adventurous explorers but at least keep up-to-date records. They insisted on checking every detail with us to make sure it was correct. Understandable, given that they'd never had an Amia visit before. In fact, they'd never had any alien visitors before, and even human ships rarely traveled to Svalbard. For them, Delta Cassiopeia, a system at the edge of known space. Doubly important, therefore, that they checked the accuracy of a database that had passed through at least half a dozen different hands before getting to them. Not a fun exercise while our life support system was making progressively more alarming wheezing noises, but you could see their point. They were an isolated colony, and if we brought a disease or other biological contaminant on board, they likely wouldn't be able to get help in time. Once we'd gone through all that, then came the hard part. They'd extended us an invitation to send a shuttle over and look over their inventory, see if they had anything that could help. Their technology was far inferior to ours, so naturally they didn't have a spare atmospheric scrubber or a power relay lying around that we could just plug in. But there was always the chance they'd have something we could jury-rig to do the job until we got home. So one of us would have to go over to the station, and we had to decide who that was going to be. "Any volunteers?" Captain Moileau asked. You'll be shocked to hear that no one put their hand up. The six of us looked at each other nervously. Two of the engineers were still battling with the power grid, and Danas was there, but looking calmly relaxed with the knowledge that no one was going to risk sending our only doctor. He was the closest thing I had to a friend on this crew. Hopefully he'd back me up if it came to that. "Surely this a job for the chief engineer," suggested Akiad, our navigator. "He always was the first to dive under a table at the first sign of trouble." "Me?" Jemot squawked. "The ship is barely holding together and you want to send the only person who knows how to fix it." That earned some side-eye from second engineer Juliet, but he let the comment pass. Engineers like to stick together, in the belief that the rest of us were just inconvenient foreign objects gumming up the works of their pristine machinery. Juliet turned to Swotus, our pilot. Practically speaking, if someone is going to have to fly the shuttle there and back, surely it should be the one with most experience as a pilot. Those old Model 32 shuttles can be hard to handle sometimes. "Oh, please, we're all rated to fly a shuttle and it's barely a 10-kilometer trip," Swotus snapped. Even an engineer couldn't mess that up. Although personally, I vote we send the crew member who somehow missed the corrosive substance in the cargo and landed us all in this guano heap to begin with. "What, you're looking at me?" shouted Lialas, our cargo specialist. "I told you, I'm not allowed to open up the shipping containers. I just have to go off what the manifest says. It was the guys back at port who screwed up. I'm not throwing myself to a pack of hungry carnivores to make up for their mistake." "Why not? It's not as if we need you," Akiad said. "I mean, you're the cargo specialist and we've already dropped off our cargo. We're all needed to keep the ship running. If we're going to send anyone to get eaten, surely it should be the dead weight." "Dead weight? A Gria rat could do your job, and it would probably complain less." "Enough!" Captain Moileau shouted. "At this rate, we'll tear each other apart before the humans even get a chance to. Also, I'd like to remind everyone that the humans have very generously offered to help us fix our ship, and have given absolutely no sign of wanting to eat us. We, a both reasonable, rational species, I am sure that us Amia can find some reasonable, rational criteria for deciding who goes over to the station." We all looked at him for a moment. Then Jemot nodded. "You're right, of course, I don't know what we were thinking." Then he looked at us. "It's obvious, we should send the captain. He's the ultimate decision-maker here. He'll have to okay whatever the humans come up with anyway. And he's clearly the most diplomatic." "What, me?" The captain's feathers suddenly stood on end. "But if I get eaten, who's going to command the ship?" "Isn't that what we have a first mate for?" asked Juliet. I had been trying to keep my head down so far, but that put me on the spot. "Well, technically yes, I'm qualified to take over command of the ship if it comes to that, but that doesn't mean—" "I'd say that settles it," said Lialas, clearly relieved that the conversation had moved on from the question of his usefulness. "A captain is supposed to lead, after all." Moileau shot me a thanks-for-nothing look and answered, "You know, you're right. I am supposed to be leading here and the final call lies with me. So I don't know why we're having a debate when I could just order one of you to go. Or more than one of you. Safety in numbers, after all. Always better to stick with the flock. Okay, let's see. We definitely need a pilot, a navigator, a doctor, and at least one engineer. Preferably the most experienced." Then he turned to me. "Speaking of experience, While it's true that a first mate can take over as captain in an emergency, the reverse is true as well. And obviously, if one of us are going to take over both roles, it makes more sense for it to be the most experienced. So that leaves 3 of us here who could go. He was good, I'd give him that. He knew that he couldn't actually just order one of us to go. Being captain might technically give him the authority, but this was just a freighter, and the worst that would happen to anyone who refused was a slight downgrade in certification when we got home. But having made the bluff, everyone had an incentive to stay on his good side, which wouldn't have mattered if we'd all been in agreement that he should go. But now he'd neatly redrawn the lines to turn it from a free-for-all into an argument with a clear majority and a clear minority, leaving me in the minority along with Lealis and Juliet. Great. Well, that's why he was the captain, and I was just the first mate. Crew management skills. Still, I wasn't about to lie down and give up just yet. I think we've been looking at this all wrong, I ventured. The question isn't who can we afford to lose. We can't afford to lose anyone over there because if we don't get what we need to fix the life support and power supply, then chances are we're not going to make it to a safe harbor. The whole question of whether we avoid getting eaten will be moot if we end up suffocating and freezing to death in deep space. Besides, as our captain so reasonably pointed out, we've had no indications that these humans have any hostile intent. As Akiad originally said, this is clearly an engineering problem, so we should send an engineer. That should get Lealis on my side by taking the heat off him and putting it onto Juliet. And since Akiad had already made the same argument, he could hardly contradict himself now. The captain wasn't the only one with crew management skills. If this was an Amia station, or a Tok station, or any other species we have a long-standing relationship with, then it would be a purely engineering problem, said Jamat. But don't you think that under these circumstances, it's far more important that we send whoever has the people skills and, dare I say, the courage to negotiate with the humans effectively? After all, if whoever we send inadvertently offends the humans and they give him nothing, then no amount of engineering skill is going to help, right? Crap. I'd forgotten engineers stick together. I should have picked on Lealis. I'm pretty sure I remember someone here talking about how the best thing about space travel is that it broadens the mind, Lealis said, jumping in before I got the chance. In fact, I distinctly remember someone saying that you haven't really lived until you've gone somewhere no Amia has ever gone before. Taken a risk in the name of exploration. Crap! I should limited my mess hall conversation to what flavor fruit paste was on the menu. Hold on a moment, when I said exploration I meant unknown spaces, not unknown species, I said, fumbling. I'm no diplomat. But you have expressed a lot of opinions about how being a spacer is, how did you put it, the purest expression of the Amia instinct for adventure, said Juliet. I'm sure said something about how you always wished you'd had the opportunity to go on a research mission. What I meant was, you get a lot of perks when you're working for the science consortium. I didn't mean, well, what better way to show everyone that you're science consortium material than by negotiating with a mysterious, highly dangerous alien race, said Akiad, clearly sensing which way the wind was blowing. I like this job fine. Couldn't be happier, in fact, given what great colleagues I get to work with, I said through a clenched beak. You did get one of the best scores on the physical, Dennis said to me out of nowhere. Given that it's likely to be a stressful situation, I think physical fitness is a factor here. Wouldn't want whoever goes to have a heart attack. Okay, so Dennis did have my back, but only so he could stab me in it. So much for friendship. If he'd decided to join the pile-on, I was doomed. His opinion carried a lot of weight as a neutral observer, more than enough to tip the scale. It would look very good on your resume. Captain Moileau, you've been talking about how you've been thinking of applying for a captaincy for a while. A positive performance report from another captain carries a lot of weight. I think I could guarantee that I could definitely make sure that you had a very good chance of getting accepted. Won't do me much good if I don't come back, I muttered, but I knew defeat was near. That's a very negative way of looking at it. You're the one who always says that you'd rather that the risks of being a spacer than risk being grounded, the captain reminded me. I may have said something along those lines, although in fairness most Amia see being stuck on the ground permanently as a fate worse than death. Moileau leaned in close and whispered, It would look a lot better for you if I didn't have to give you a direct order. Wouldn't look good for you if I refused a direct order, I whispered back. Maybe. But the rest of the crew would definitely follow an order to drag you to the shuttle by your tail. Of course, that wouldn't look good for either of us. But if you aren't willing to volunteer, he left the sentence hanging there, twisting in the breeze, much like me. Well, I said louder. Upon reflection and taking on board the arguments for and against it, I think there's a clear choice here. Now, for the sake of modesty, I've hesitated to put myself forward, but I've decided that for the sake of the mission and the well-being of the ship, I have to say that I think I'm the best person for the job. Hear, hear, said Akiad. Couldn't have put it better myself, said Giamat. Moilo clapped me on the back. Well, I guess that settles it. We'll start getting the shuttle prepped while you get into a spacesuit. Don't take too long, or it might antagonize the humans. As I left the bridge, I passed Denas, still leaning back on the console as if he hadn't a care in the universe. Why? I hissed under my breath. Believe it or not, I actually think you're the best person for the job, he said, and that might actually have made me feel a little better if he had not then shrugged and added, also, I was getting bored of all the arguing. Thanks a lot. Seriously, though, all our lives depend on this. Would you really want to trust it to Lialis or Juliet? Well, when you put it like that. Don't worry. To the best of my medical knowledge, there haven't been any violent encounters between humans and Amia yet. Medical journals tend to make a big deal of it when someone dies in an unusually gruesome way. You're not helping, you know. All right, think of it this way. If you do get eaten, we'll probably all slowly suffocate anyway. Actually, that does help a little. Don't mention it. Now come on. I've got to give you one last physical to check for pathogens before you're allowed onto the colony. You never know your luck. Maybe you're carrying a horrible disease. You know you really need to work on your bedside manner. The Mark 32 shuttle was indeed a pain in the cloaca to handle. But as Swotus had said, we were basically right on top of the station. If we'd been orbiting homeworld, it would have taken a certified pilot to safely navigate the constellation of habitats, satellites, and random debris the cleaners had missed. But out here, orbiting this desolate, nameless world, take it slowly, and even a complete novice couldn't screw it up, and I'd done my basic flight training the same as every other spacer. Still, it was a lonely ride crawling along between my ship and the station, the inside of the cockpit painted a muddy brown by the light reflected off the planet below. As the featherlight receded behind me and Svalbard got larger and larger, it struck me just how much effort it must have taken to construct an orbital habitat all the way out here. As far as we could gather, there were no other human colonies nearby, and although they were a spacefaring species, they were fairly technologically primitive. Relative to us at least, but then who isn't? It wouldn't have been too much of a challenge for us, but for humans? You had to admire their sense of adventure. Maybe this was a species worth meeting. Apart from our official ambassadors, no Amia had had any face-to-face contact with humans so far. I'd met plenty of Toktok during my travels. Some UNK, Kalukamsku, a few Statstan, didn't like them. A handful of Upau Rokvau, very polite if a bit weird, and even some Ishoa once, who were about as inscrutable as you'd expect. It was part of the reason I loved space travel, because it gave me the chance to meet all the incredible, unique aliens populating the galaxy. Maybe humans were an amazingly strange and interesting species, and I'd be the first Amia to get to know them. I could be about to make some memories that would last the rest of my life. Of course, that might be because the rest of my life wouldn't be very long, and a memory didn't necessarily have to be a good one to last. Did they kill their prey before they ate it, or did they just tuck in? Our database had been worryingly sparse on details. I managed to maneuver myself into their shuttle bay without splatting myself across the wall, so that was the first hurdle overcome. Good start, I could take that as a good omen. Positive thinking. There is no reason to believe that they have any intention of eating me. My heart was already pounding. Dennis had been right, damn him. Amia physiology being what it is, there was a significant chance that someone like Giamat, who I suspect had tweaked our gravity down slightly so he could still get airborne, would have passed out, or had a heart attack before the negotiations even started, which would be an awkward way to make first contact. The doors of the shuttle bay closed and I waited for it to pressurize. When it was done, the console in front of me told me that atmospheric pressure was normal, or slightly above normal for Amia actually, but I also got a notification from the station. I'd followed an automated beacon in, and the notification was delivered as text, just like all the Featherlight's communications with the station so far. They most likely did this to make it easier on the translation program, much easier to translate text than speech. But so far, I hadn't had any direct contact with the humans, Our database at least had a few pictures, but how did I know that the pictures were accurate? That they hadn't been toned down to make them look less terrifying? I needed to stop doing that. There was no point in getting myself more worked up than I already was. I sent an acknowledgement to the message, then, with a last moment of hesitation, I left the shuttle and headed for the airlock. It opened automatically as I approached. The messages we'd exchanged already had said there would be humans waiting to greet me just the other side. We have a saying, you don't remember the first time you flew, which is not so much a saying as a developmental fact. Most Amia learn to fly before they're old enough to remember the event. Some people are slower than others, but most get in a few baby flaps before they're old enough to form coherent sentences, which scientists have linked to forming concrete memories. Brains process information very differently before and after we learn to talk. In fact, it's not just a saying or a developmental fact, so much as a societal obsession and a rich field of philosophy. Flying is second nature to us to the point where we barely think about it, yet it's also fundamental to our lives. Would we value it more if we could remember the moment when we first experienced the freedom of flight for the first time? They tell you, you don't remember the first time you flew when you're hesitating before doing something risky. The point being that once you've done it, you won't even remember why you were scared of it, which is often true. But people sometimes forget that in the old days, before modern compassionate parenting, there were a small but non-zero number of fledglings who'd take their first flight and splat beak first into the ground, resulting in broken bones or death. Amia philosophy does not have a concept of karma, although we've encountered the idea in other species. The belief that there is a moral balance to the universe, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, a moral version of the fundamental laws of motion. If we did have a concept of karma, I might have been drawing a link between the number of times I'd used the phrase, "You don't remember the first time you flew" on someone else, and my current predicament. In fairness, they were for things like taking a mission into deep space or trying what the Talk euphemistically refer to as root jelly, not for meeting a dangerous alien race. And the people I'd said it to were a bunch of cowards who needed a good shove. But if we did believe in karma, I might see a connection. Just as well we don't. And I could pretend this wasn't all my own fault. Deep breath, try to stay calm, and step into the airlock. The pressure was already equalized, so it didn't take long to cycle. The door slid sideways to reveal. They were big, not huge, like the Kalu Kamsku, but Amia generally top out at 1.50 meters, and none of the three individuals in front of me were under 170, which meant they had a good 30 centimeters or more on me. More than that, they were broad. Even more impressive in this gravity, which was a little more than I was comfortable with, although then again that might have something to do with Giamat's weight issues. They might actually be able to exert more force than Kalu Kamsku, even with their relatively much smaller bodies. In other words, they would easily be able to tear me limb from limb if they felt like it. Don't panic. This was all expected. You saw pictures of them back on the Featherlight. You knew roughly what humans looked like. Take it as a positive sign that they actually do look like their pictures, and aren't slavering monsters with claws bigger than your head. At least that's what I told myself. But logic can only do so much against an instinct that's probably common to every living thing in the universe, to be nervous around a large predator. Well, except maybe the UNK, but they're always weird. The rational part of my mind at least was able to remind me that the worst thing to do in front of a predator is show fear. At the touch of a button, my helmet retracted back into my suit, and I stood there, exposed. One of the humans stepped forward and spoke. The words were translated by a device pinned to his chest, which rendered them as, "Greetings. We are pleased to meet you and are eager to offer any assistance we can. Good start." The translation seemed a little stiff, but that was to be expected. It would have been nice to have my own translation, but that's life on a freighter for you. If we'd been working for the Science Consortium, our database would have been updated with the very latest version at each port, but no one thought it was particularly urgent for a freighter carrying machine parts. One of those non-urgent maintenance jobs that you only realize actually was very urgent after it's far too late to do any good. I'd be relying on their translation software, which was no doubt primitive, but it was better than nothing. We were lucky they had a translation matrix for our language at all, but they obviously thought Amia human relations were more important than we did. Sometimes I wonder if we think too much of ourselves. We had tried uploading their translation matrix, but the formatting was too different for our programs to use. My suit's universal translator was using its adaptive programming to try to parse their matrix and create its own, and the more of the language it heard, the closer it would come to having something usable. But until then, I was totally reliant on the humans to communicate. I am the first officer of the freighter Featherlight. My name is Amosad. A stream of syllables issued from the speaker on the human's chest, and he nodded. At least I assumed it was a he. I had no way of telling the difference between male and female. Welcome aboard the colony Svalbard. I am the governor by name of John Osborne. The governor was around 1 meter 80 tall, and had short plumage on top of his head that was black with streaks of gray near the ears. This is the chief medical officer by name of Yulia Fyodorovna. This female will, while you stay here, be monitoring the health of your body. And this is our chief engineer by name of Casper Magnusson. This male will assist you in the reparation of your ship. Governor Osborne gestured to each of his colleagues as he spoke. Yulia Fyodorovna was the shortest, and had long, pale yellow plumage growing out the top of her head down to her shoulders. Casper Magnusson was the tallest, and had the same shade of plumage but much shorter. Gender dimorphism? Were the males generally taller with less elaborate plumage? I wasn't a zoologist, but didn't males generally have more elaborate plumage? Amia don't have significant gender dimorphism, but the longer and more colorful the feathers, the more likely that person was male. Or maybe he was larger because engineering involved more physical work, and kept his plumage artificially short so it didn't get caught up in the machinery. But the governor had short plumage too. Did that mean he was male or a former engineer? That was the trouble with aliens. You could never make assumptions. I needed to stop overthinking and get down to business. It was all very well trying to play scientist, but I wasn't working for the science consortium. I was first mate on a freighter, and if I didn't do this quickly, my colleagues were going to suffocate. We've prepared a list of equipment we need, I told them. The most urgent problem is the filters and air pumps in the life support system, which were damaged by smoke. I have the specifications here, including detailed diagrams. I unstrapped the data slate from my arm and held it out. Apart from that, there are sections of our power grid that need to be replaced, but that's likely to be more complicated. We'd be grateful if you're able to help but so long as we fix our life support, we can probably make it to an Amia colony on low power. Their translators echoed my words in their own language, or at least I hoped they did. I had no idea how much they had understood, but no one reached out to take the data slate. The governor looked round at the chief engineer, who in turn looked at the chief medical officer. Their doctor cleared him, she said. The translator kept its flat intonation, but her body language, as far as I could read it, suggested she was addressing the chief engineer only. The results conformed with all the protocols for alien contact laid out by Earth. I can give no further expertise on this issue. So they were a little nervous of me too. That was comforting. Chief Magnusson will be happy to assist you in any way he can, the governor said. So the convention for abbreviating names was title plus the second half of their name. Governor Osborne continued. I am of the understanding that he has laid out some equipment that might be suitable in one of our cargo bays. Dr. Fyodorovna will stay with you to monitor your health. Is that really necessary? The doctor asked. My offspring, I think it is necessary, the governor insisted. We need to be absolutely sure he's uninfected. But we should be preparing for, she started, and then stopped. Never mind, you're right. This is more important. Once he's done with Magnusson, your offspring will have a chance to become more closely acquainted with our visitor. Surely they would appreciate that most of all. You are correct. I was thoroughly confused by this point. Have I come at a bad time? I asked. Not at all, the governor said. Perhaps he was trying to be reassuring, but he bared his teeth. A subconscious reflex? It was disconcerting to say the least. In fact, I would be pleased to show you more of our station, if you are interested. But I understand your situation is urgent, so let us postpone that until your ship is out of danger. Then the chief engineer said, Come on, let us start work. We must be finished for the big feast. Big feast? I'm sorry, what? But before I could ask any follow-up questions, Magnusson had already started heading down the corridor. Dr. Fyodorovna and Chief Magnusson will do everything possible to see to your requirements, Governor Osborne said. I must continue with my duties as governor, but if you need anything else, or have any questions, you can contact me any time. Your suit's communicator will now be registered by our internal comm system. Okay, thank you, I said. I wanted to ask about this feast, but didn't quite know how to raise the subject. Please, this way, Dr. Fyodorovna said, gesturing after Magnusson. We left Osborne behind and hurried after Magnuson. I quickly contacted the Featherlight. I'm on board and we've made our introductions. And they haven't tried to eat you? Moilot asked. No, I whispered back, hoping their translator hadn't picked that up. They're taking me to their engineering section now. I'll check back in as soon as I've figured out if they have the parts we need. See, I told you everything would be okay. That was Danas, with the cheer of someone who didn't have to test his theories personally. But then he got serious. Make sure you focus on replacements for the life support systems. Jamat's saying the damage was worse than we originally thought. His people are struggling to hold things together, and I'm getting worried about the buildup of particulates in the air. We may start to suffer health damage long before we're in danger of suffocating. Do you want me to ask if the rest of you can come over to the station? I don't think we're quite there yet. Coward. Jamat's managed to redirect most of the polluted air into the cargo bays. We're fine for now. And when we're not fine, we'll be able to use our suits. But still, don't take too long. Moilot added. Don't worry about us, just concentrate on your job. We'll keep you updated as the situation develops. Featherlight out. Believe me, I thought. I'm not going to waste too much time worrying about you. I'm far too busy worrying about myself. That said, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Chief Magnuson evidently felt he had better things to be doing because he walked so fast that I could barely keep up. But Dr. Fyodorovna stuck to me like glue. We were able to talk en route, and I was able to learn a few basic things about Svalbard and the people living on it. It was a relatively new colony, and right at the far edge of human expansion. It had been named after one of the most remote islands on their home planet, Earth, and it literally meant cold edge. Around 50,000 individuals, perhaps half of whom had been born and raised on this remote outpost and knew no other home. The primary purpose was to terraform the planet below, the imaginatively named Delta Cassiopeae 4. Currently, they were in the early stages, and given that human lifespans weren't too dissimilar to Amia, with the technology available to them, most of the station's current population would be long dead by the time the planet was finally made habitable. In the meantime, the colony supported itself by harvesting various rare minerals from the planet, as well as a few organic compounds. The planet had been completely sterile before humans came along, so it was the perfect petri dish to culture certain engineered microorganisms that could be used both for trade and to support the station itself. The translator wasn't quite up to a detailed discussion about human economic and political systems, but I did manage to work out that the station was largely self-supporting for basic goods and was self-governing on internal matters, but relied on Earth to manage its external affairs. It seemed that many of Earth's colonies were only loosely affiliated with their home planet, or entirely independent, and this sometimes led to friction. Yulia, as she told me to call her, was very quick to assure me that there were currently no tensions with any other polity. Earth used to have an armed spaceship on a regular patrol through the area to discourage aggression, but since the conflict with the Kalu Kamsku, the independent colonies and the United Nations of Earth and its dependencies had been of one mind like never before. Still not exactly friendly, but Svalbard wasn't worried about any hostile ships showing up. She also told me that in the very unlikely event a hostile ship did appear, the station was equipped with railguns and missiles. There were also armed satellites orbiting the planet, hiding in the most intense parts of the magnetosphere where they couldn't be targeted accurately. Svalbard wasn't considered a military outpost, but it could defend itself against the kind of minor threats likely to occur on the far frontier. It took me a few questions to get to the bottom of what the translator meant by railguns, missiles, and military. When I did, the next question I asked myself was, why did she think this would make me feel any better? Because I hadn't been worried about other hostile humans showing up until she mentioned it. And now that that fear had been added to my already far too long list, it wasn't assuaged by the fact that Svalbard apparently had enough weaponry to easily blow the Featherlight to itty-bitty pieces. In other words, if something went wrong, there was no chance my ship would be able to escape. Now, if I were in a nervous frame of mind, I might think that she was not so subtly threatening me that there was no point in trying to run. And maybe that did occur to me. But after a moment's thought, I considered the fact that maybe humans were so used to living their lives under constant threat from other humans that it was just polite to assure visitors that they would be defended from any attacks while they were aboard. Yulia had never met an alien before. In fact, until quite recently, humans didn't even know other intelligent species existed. She was not a diplomat or a xenopsychologist, and couldn't be expected to anticipate just how different humans were from most species in the galaxy. Until she offered me a clear sign that violence was on her mind, I thought it best to give her the benefit of the doubt, especially given the fact that her translator wasn't perfect. My own was slowly picking up more and more of her language as she talked, but it would take a while before it was able to make sense of the language files that had been shared with us. In the meantime, I had no way of knowing what nuances it was missing, but I could tell there was a gap between what Yulia was saying and what I was hearing. I could only hope that I wasn't saying anything that could mistakenly offend her. But all that was just what the rational part of my mind was thinking. The non-rational part, and if I'm being honest with myself, that's quite a large part, couldn't stop thinking about what a violent species this was. Even most predators don't regularly engage in aggression against other members of their own species. To take my mind off my barely suppressed anxiety, I asked her about the decor. The corridors we'd been walking along had an extremely functional aesthetic. Slightly off-white paneling on the walls with the occasional maintenance hatch, and a tiled floor with ridges for grip. Something an Amia would never have thought of. It's amazing how different your perspective is when you're limited to walking. But as we got deeper into the station, I started seeing what could only be described as decorative touches, clearly not part of the original design. Mostly long ropes covered in glittery metallic hair, but also clusters of small, blinking lights that didn't seem to illuminate anything. I asked Yulia if they had any particular significance or were purely aesthetic, and she told me that they were temporary decorations that had been put up for a celebration the next day. I asked her what the happy occasion was, since as far as I could see, this remote and rather Spartan colony didn't have much to celebrate. But all she would say was that it would be too complicated to explain. Even when I pressed her for more details, she declined to say more than that the decorations were a traditional practice brought with them from Earth that dated back several hundred years. I tried to think of anything that might have happened recently, like mining ship returning successfully from the planet, that might have prompted a celebration. But Yulia hadn't mentioned anything like that. As far as I could see, the only thing of note that had happened here recently was the arrival of the Featherlight. And if they had put up these decorations for us, surely they would have mentioned it, wouldn't they? I was distracted from that train of thought when we passed through an open concourse, and suddenly I found myself being stared at by hundreds of humans. I almost activated the jets on my suit, but stopped myself just in time. I must have been visibly startled, though, because Yulia said, "There is no need to be alarmed. They are just curious. The security officers will keep them back." Sure enough, there was a line of larger humans dressed in the same style of outfit, making sure the crowd behind them were kept well out of the way of our route. I wasn't sure if they were armed, or indeed if I wanted them to be. The humans behind them were at least waiting obediently, not trying to push their way through. They were a mix of shapes and sizes, and some of them were much smaller than me. Juveniles, I assumed, which was hopefully a sign that they didn't intend violence, although then again children tend to be unpredictable whatever the species. I wondered how big a human had to be before they became capable of taking down prey my size. Just relax. Yulia is probably right, they're just curious. They've never seen an alien after all, and this station doesn't look like it gets much excitement. Just stay calm. It was all very well telling myself that, but having several hundred pairs of predatory eyes following me was not an enjoyable experience. I was very glad when we were out of the concourse and back in the empty corridors, which it occurred to me had probably been deliberately kept clear by station security. Fortunately, it wasn't too much further to our destination. I wasn't used to doing that much walking, and my feet were starting to hurt. Naturally, a station designed by a flightless species wasn't going to have much room to fly around in, but some kind of internal transport system would have been nice. Of course, it was only after I mentioned this that Yulia told me that they did indeed have a monorail system, but the governor wanted to make sure my contact with the station's inhabitants was as limited as possible, and the monorail couldn't be closed off as easily. The cargo bay about 20 meters on each side and 5 meters high. You get used to the sense of claustrophobia on a freighter, but it was nice to get a chance to stretch my wings a bit, if only metaphorically since I was still wearing my suit. 5 humans were waiting for us, and from the way they deferred to Magnuson, it was clear that they were junior engineers. The obvious clique-iness in the way they behaved, not just towards me but to Yulia as well, reminded me very much of Giamat and his underlings. Some things transcend species. They had laid out enough equipment to cover most of the cargo bay. I recognized none of it. Of course, that wasn't really surprising given that it was all alien technology, and far more primitive than what I was used to working with. Either way, it was encouraging that they'd gone to all this trouble, but it meant that Magnuson and his underlings had to go through the specifications of each one with me in detail, which was exactly as tedious as it sounds. It took the better part of an hour just for me to properly explain exactly what parts of the Featherlight were broken. Of course, it all would have gone at least somewhat faster if I had been an engineer myself. I had all the mandatory certifications in ship maintenance required for an officer on a deep space ship, but that didn't mean I could explain it to an alien. They say that if you really want to be sure you really understood something, you should try explaining it to a child. Trying to explain a electrostatically separated layered monomolecular filter to a human was basically the same experience, and it left me certain that I really did not understand it. Chief Magnuson seemed surprised when I told him I wasn't an engineer. I explained that our engineers were busy trying to keep our ship running, and it had been decided I would be the liaison because I had seniority, and while that might not be entirely accurate, if he came to the conclusion that we were a bunch of idiots for sending someone who didn't know one end of an air pump from another, then he understood everything he needed to. The one good outcome of the long hours spent going over the junk the humans had managed to come up with was that my translator absorbed more and more of their language, enough that it started feeding me little snippets of what the humans were saying. Not that different from what their own translators were coming out with, but it added a little extra nuance. And most importantly, it was learning. Yulia stayed with me the entire time, periodically checking my vital signs to make sure that the slightly higher gravity and marginally different atmospheric composition wasn't having an effect on me. Denis had already assured me that it was well within what Amia could tolerate for short periods, but the humans didn't want to take any chances. It was quite touching how concerned they were for my health. While Yulia monitored me, I was able to talk a bit more with her about her life on the station. She had emigrated from Earth not long after qualifying as a doctor because of a shortage of medical personnel here. Although she'd only intended to stay for a few years, she formed a relationship with a male, and they now had 2 young children together. Apparently humans carried and gave birth to live young rather than laying eggs, which sounded horrible, but she seemed happy about it. She'd come to think of Svalbard as her home, and had no intention of going back to Earth since she thought it would be too difficult for her mate and offspring to adapt to such a different lifestyle. Apparently, human children were very dependent on their parents, more so even than Amia, and adults had a correspondingly strong parenting instinct. Yulia mentioned several times that her offspring would be missing her. After we'd been at it for several hours with no end in sight, I suggested that she go and check on them, to build a rapport, and because I didn't want the doctor who was monitoring my health to be distracted, better that she go check on them and come back focused than having her mind wander when I was about to have a heart attack. The downside was that it left me alone with the engineers, but they were as eager for a break as I was by that point, so after I finally convinced Yulia to take a few minutes off, I suggested we halt work until she got back. It wasn't like we were getting very far after all. Magnuson apparently took this as an invitation to leave too. Maybe he had children, although it was hard to imagine him being interested in anything that didn't have a circuit board. That left me alone with the 5 junior engineers, who'd been letting Magnuson do all the talking and didn't have their translators switched on, which meant they didn't think that I could understand them. In fact, I was just glad of the chance to rest, and wasn't really listening to them anyway. But my translator was giving me snippets of their conversation through my earbud, which they couldn't see, and it picked up this. Are you ready for the feast tomorrow? Almost. There is still the issue of the food. What issue? It has arrived now. I wasn't sure it was a good idea to have it specially imported, but it's here now. No problem. It's still alive. That's a problem. Have you ever tried to kill one of those things? I've never even seen one before. It's not the sort of thing we get here. Precisely. It's the first time I've ever seen one too, and I doubt the food preparers have any more experience than we do. I've heard they are powerful creatures. What if it doesn't want to get eaten? You may be right. I will be confident in the outcome when it is carved up and on the plate in front of me. Hey, that one is looking at us. Oh crap, they'd noticed me staring. I immediately tried to look like I was very interested in the machinery in front of me. Do you think we should switch our translators on and try to talk to it? What if it becomes concerned? The doctor shouldn't have left us alone with it. She needs to monitor its health. If it is unhealthy, the big feast will be a failure. I think we should wait for her to come back, it's her job. Okay, that couldn't be what it sounded like. Surely. I'd finally started to trust humans a little, and now, well, as much as I wanted to put it down to a translation error, I knew that my translator was getting most of what they were saying. And how else could you interpret that?